I was 78 years old, and my own son abandoned me on a stretcher in the crowded hallway of the emergency room. He had a business dinner that was too important to miss. But he didn't know that a nurse heard everything. And the phrase she said to me on the phone later would have made my son drop everything and drive back as if his life depended on it. But by then, mine no longer depended on him. The sound of the emergency room is a symphony of chaos. High-pitched beeps from monitors, the screeching of stretcher wheels on worn linoleum, muffled and urgent conversations behind paper-thin curtains. For me, Arthur, at 78, the loudest sound was the automatic door closing, taking my son, David, with it. "Dad, I really need to go," he said, without even making eye contact. His eyes were glued to the bright screen of his cell phone, his thumbs typing furiously. "It's just a cough. You probably caught a cold. The doctor will give you an antibiotic, and you'll be home in a few hours. I have this meeting with the investors from Dubai. It's crucial." The pain in my chest wasn't just the strange pressure that made me call in the first place. It was an older, deeper pain, the pain of being a burden. "But David, I'm not feeling well. I'm dizzy." My voice came out weak, almost a whisper. I hated sounding so fragile. I, who taught him to ride a bike, who carried him on my shoulders during parades, who worked 2 jobs to pay for his business school, was now reduced to a trembling plea. He finally looked at me, but not with concern, with impatience, a crease of irritation between his perfectly arched eyebrows. "Dad, please, don't make a scene. You know how hard I work for this meeting. See you later, okay? Call me when you know anything." And so he was gone. Not a pat on the shoulder, not a take care. Just the back of his expensive suit disappearing into the crowd. I lay there, on a stretcher parked against the wall of a busy corridor. The air conditioning blew a frigid air that seemed to penetrate my bones. Every person who passed, hurried nurses, doctors with clipboards, other groaning patients, seemed to look right through me. I was invisible, a piece of old furniture left behind. The minutes turned into an hour, then 2. The pain in my chest radiated to my left arm. The dizziness worsened. I tried to get someone's attention, but my voice was lost in the noise. I felt like a castaway on a tiny island, watching ships pass in the distance, indifferent to my desperate waving. It was in this moment of utter despair that a pair of white shoes stopped beside my stretcher. I looked up and saw a face. A gentle face, framed by dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Brown eyes that didn't look right through. "For me, but for me." "Sir," she said, her voice calm but firm. "My name is Sophia. I'm one of the nurses. You look pale. How are you feeling?" The words came out in a torrent, mixed with shortness of breath. "My chest, it hurts. And my son, he had to go." Shame burned me. I was making excuses for my own abandonment. She didn't say anything about David. Instead, her hand touched my wrist, her professional fingers searching for my pulse. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Your pulse is irregular, and you're sweating profusely." She turned, her calmness transforming into a silent authority. "I need an ECG here now, and prepare trauma room too." Suddenly, I was no longer invisible. People rushed toward me. Wires were taped to my chest. An oxygen mask was placed over my face. As they hurriedly carried me down the corridor, my eyes met Sophia's. She gave me an almost imperceptible nod, a silent promise that I was no longer alone. As the overhead lights buzzed overhead, a clear thought cut through the fog of pain and confusion. David didn't think it was anything. He left me here to die because of a dinner party. And this nurse, a complete stranger, saved my life in less than 5 minutes. Inside the trauma room, while the doctor shouted terms I didn't understand, T segment elevation, acute myocardial infarction, I clung to that thought. The injustice was as sharp as the pain in my chest. I gave my son everything I had, my time, my money, my unconditional love. And in return, I received the silence of a hospital corridor. Later, stabilized, and in an observation room, Sophia came in to check my vital signs. The room was quiet. Night had fallen over Miami. The only sound was the soft beep of the heart monitor, a constant reminder of my fragility. "You're much better," she said with a tired smile. That was close. You had a significant heart attack. I nodded, my throat dry. Thank you. My voice trailed off. She placed a hand on my forearm. We're trying to contact your son. The number he left at admission is going straight to voicemail. Of course it was. The dinner. The investors. His important life. A wave of bitterness and sadness washed over me. I was his father, and I was on the priority list below a plate of lobster with strangers. Sophia saw the change in my face. She pulled up a chair and sat down, a gesture that seemed to go beyond her obligations. Mr. Collins, I was at reception when your son dropped you off here. I heard what he said. My face burned with humiliation. It happens more often than you think, she continued, her voice low and full of an empathy that broke my heart. Sons, daughters, they get busy. They underestimate. They forget. She paused, but forgetting isn't an excuse. Especially not today. She glanced at my bedside table, where my old, battered wallet lay. During admission, they'd taken everything out and put in a plastic bag. May I? She asked, pointing to the wallet. I nodded, confused. With surprising care, she opened the wallet. She went past my expired credit cards and my old driver's license. Then she pulled out a folded, faded photo from a plastic compartment. It was a picture of me and my late wife, Martha, on our wedding day. Behind it was another, smaller one, a picture of 5-year-old David, smiling toothlessly on my shoulder. Your wife? She asked softly. Martha, I whispered. She passed away 10 years ago. Cancer. I'm so sorry. She looked from Martha's picture to David's picture, and then to me. A profound understanding seemed to dawn on her. She wasn't just seeing an elderly patient. She was seeing an entire story, a life of love, sacrifice, and now, profound loneliness. Mr. Collins, she said, her tone shifting. There was a new determination there. We need your son to come. There are decisions to be made. About catheterization, about future care. He's your emergency contact and your healthcare proxy. He won't answer, I said, resignation weighing on every word. His dinner is more important. Sophia looked me in the eyes. A fire blazed in hers. Oh, he will, she said, with chilling conviction. Leave it to me. I know exactly what to say. She stood, put the photo back in her wallet with an unexpected bow, and walked toward the door. She stopped in the threshold and looked back. Rest, Mr. Collins. Just rest. The night isn't over yet. And with that, she left, leaving me in the silent room with a constant beeping of the monitor and a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But it wasn't the hope that my son would return out of love. It was a dark and intense curiosity about what the hell that nurse would say to break through the wall of selfishness David had built around himself. The following hours were a blur of tests, medications, and anonymous faces in white coats. They talked about me, but rarely to me. I was a collection of symptoms, a graph on a clipboard, a damaged heart to be repaired. The humanity Sophia showed me seemed an aberration, a moment of warmth in a frozen universe. Alone in the dark room, my mind wandered, as it always did when loneliness set in. It returned to Martha. I remembered the scent of lavender in her hair, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she laughed. I remembered her last days, in that same hospital, in a room very similar to this one. The illness had weakened her, robbed her of her strength, but never her spirit. And I remember David. He was in his early 20s at the time, fresh out of college, full of ambition. He did visit, yes, but always in a hurry, laptop in one hand, cell phone in the other. He loved his mother, I knew that, but he saw her illness as an obstacle, an interruption in his meteoric rise. The clearest memory, however, was of the day of the funeral. After everyone had left, only David and I stood before the cold marble gravestone. The sky was gray, threatening rain. I felt hollow, as if a vital part of me had been ripped away. David placed his hand on my shoulder. His eyes were red. Dad, he said, his voice hoarse with pain. I promise. I promise you, and I promise her. You will never be alone. I will take care of you. Always. At that time, his words were a balm, an anchor in a sea of grief. I believed him. I clung to that promise like a man clings to a lifeboat. But the years, like the tide, erode even the hardest rock. His career took off. He got married, had children who barely knew me, moved into a huge house in Coral Gables. Visits became phone calls. Phone calls became text messages. Text messages became silences filled with apologies. I had sold my carpentry workshop, my refuge, my passion, to help him with the down payment on his first house. "It's an investment, Dad," he said, "for our future." But it was his future. I traded the smell of sawdust and the touch of polished wood for the loneliness of a small apartment and the humiliation of having to ask for help going to the supermarket. Digital exclusion was another barrier. David gave me a smartphone for Christmas, but it was an indecipherable labyrinth to me. The icons were small, the menus confusing. "It's easy, Dad, just tap here." For him, maybe. For me, it was just another reminder of my obsolescence, of the world rushing ahead while I lagged behind. I could barely use the device to make calls, let alone browse the internet or use the messaging apps he preferred. The monitor's beep brought me back to the present. The pain of the memory was almost worse than the physical pain. The broken promise, the ignored sacrifice, the abandonment. Everything converged on that moment, in that hospital room. I wasn't just an old man with a sick heart. I was the personification of a forgotten promise. The door opened silently, and Sophia entered. This time, she wasn't in uniform. She was wearing civilian clothes, a denim jacket, and carrying a bag. Her shift had ended, but she was there. "I didn't mean to scare you," she said softly. "I just wanted to see how you were before you went home." "You didn't need to," I murmured, but the gratitude in my voice was palpable. She approached. "I called your son." My heart skipped a beat, and his answering machine said he was in a meeting and couldn't be disturbed. So, I called the restaurant. I asked to speak to the host. I stared at her, shocked by her audacity. I told the host it was a medical emergency from Jackson Memorial Hospital and that I needed David Collins on the phone immediately. She paused, a small smile playing on her lips. It's amazing how mentioning a hospital can cut through the red tape. She told me that after a few minutes of waiting, an arrogant and irritated voice answered. "This is David Collins. What's so important that it couldn't wait?" And then Sophia told me what she replied. It wasn't a shout or an accusation. It was a lethal, professional, and cutting calm. "Mr. Collins, this is Nurse Sophia from Jackson Memorial. Your father, Arthur Collins, has been admitted with an acute myocardial infarction. He's stable for now, but the situation is serious." She said she heard an impatient sigh on the other end of the line. Okay, I understand." "Seriously? How seriously?" "I'll be there in the morning. I literally can't leave here right now." That's when Sophia delivered the blow. The phrase she had crafted, the weapon she found in my wallet and in our brief conversation. She continued, in the same calm, clinical tone, "I understand your obligations, sir. However, his condition is delicate, and he's a little confused. He calls for a woman named Martha, and he mentioned a promise you made at her funeral, about never leaving him alone." Sophia paused dramatically, letting the words hang in the air. And then, she added the final touch. "As his healthcare proxy, your presence is legally required to discuss care guidelines and possible surgical interventions. If you cannot attend, we will have to consult the hospital's ethics board to make decisions on his behalf. The process may take time. Tommy may not have. And, of course, all of this will be documented in his medical record." Silence. A deep, heavy silence hung on the other end of the line. Sophia told me she could almost hear the gears turning in David's head. The mention of Martha was the emotional bullet, the promise, the trigger of guilt. But the mention of the power of attorney, legal guidelines, and ethics board was the pragmatic bullet. It was language he understood. It was about control, responsibility, and potential legal complications. She had him cornered, masterfully blending the sentimental with the procedural. I'm on my way," David stammered, the arrogance completely evaporating from his voice. And the call ended. Sophia finished her story and looked at me. "He should arrive in about 30 minutes, depending on traffic." I was stunned. That woman, in a 2-minute call, had done what I hadn't been able to in 10 years. She reminded him not only of his duty, but of his humanity. She used the past not to hold me back, but to set me free. "Why'd you do this?" I asked, my voice choked with emotion. "Go all this way for a stranger?" Sophia sat on the edge of my bed. Her eyes, the nurses, usually so professional, were teary-eyed. "My father," she said softly, He died 2 years ago. Alone. In a nursing home. I was a nurse in another state. Always busy. Always with an excuse. When they called me, it was too late. I live with that guilt every day. She took a deep breath. I couldn't save my father from his loneliness. But I can, at least, ensure that another father doesn't go through the same thing tonight. No one deserves to be a burden. In that moment, the bond between us solidified. We were no longer nurse and patient. We were two souls united by the universal experience of loss and the struggle for dignity. She stood to leave. Be strong, Arthur. When he arrives, remember, you're not the only one who needs him. Tonight, he needs you. To remind him of who he is. Or who he should be. She left, and I stood there, the monitor beeping now, sounding like a countdown. David was coming. But the man he would find would not be the same frail, pleading father he abandoned in the hallway. Thanks to a nurse with a broken heart and a soul of steel, he would find Arthur Collins. And Arthur Collins had something to say. For David, the world was a series of transactions. Time was money. Contacts were capital. Emotions were, more often than not, inefficiencies. The dinner at the luxurious restaurant in Betrayal was the epitome of this philosophy. The Dubai investors weren't buying his project. They were buying his confidence, his unwavering control. When the host discreetly approached his table and whispered about a medical emergency at Jackson Memorial, David's first reaction was irritation. An interruption. His father and his impeccably bad timing. He picked up the phone, jaw clenched, ready to dismiss the nurse with cold efficiency. This is David Collins. What's so important that it couldn't wait? The nurse's calm voice on the other end of the line began with the medical jargon he expected. Acute myocardial infarction. Stable for now. Serious situation. David processed the words as he would a market report. Serious. Okay, that meant a morning visit. Maybe rearranging his schedule. He could handle it. Okay, I understand, he said impatiently. How serious? I'll be there in the morning. I literally can't leave here now. And then came the words that shattered his armor. He's a little confused. He's calling for a woman named Martha. Martha, his mother's name. A name he hadn't heard aloud in years. Instantly, the image of the opulent restaurant dissolved. He was no longer in Betrayal, surrounded by men in expensive suits. He was in a gray cemetery, in his early 20s, the smell of damp earth in the air, the hand on his shoulder being his father's, a hand that, at the time, felt like the strongest thing in the world. He mentioned a promise you made at her funeral, about never leaving him alone. The sentence hit him like a punch to the gut. The air left his lungs. The promise. My God, the promise. He had buried it under a decade of quarterly reports, international flights, and networking dinners. But the nurse unearthed it with the precision of a surgeon. The guilt, cold and nauseating, rose in his throat. But it was the final part that galvanized him, that transformed the paralyzing guilt into active panic. Your presence is legally required to discuss care guidelines. If you cannot attend, we will have to consult the hospital's ethics board. All of this will be documented in your medical record. Legally required. Ethics board. Documented. These were her words. This was his arena. The nurse wasn't just appealing to his conscience. She was threatening his control. She was implying that decisions would be made without him. That his authority as his son and proxy was being questioned because of his negligence. The idea of an ethics board deciding his father's fate with a written record of his failure to attend was more terrifying than any failed business deal. I'm on my way, he stammered, the strange sound in his own ears. He tossed a $100 bill on the table, muttered family emergency to the stunned investors, and rushed out of the restaurant without looking back. The humid Miami night hit him. He handed the keys to the valet, his heart pounding against his ribs. The wait for the car felt like an eternity. Behind the wheel of his Mercedes, he tore through the streets of Miami. Red lights were cues. Horns were background noise. His mind was a whirlwind. The image of his father, frail and pale in the emergency room hallway. His own carelessness. It's just a cough, Dad. The casual cruelty of his words haunted him now. And above all, the promise. You'll never be alone. I'll take care of you. Always. He had said it. He had felt it. What happened to that young man who felt those words so vehemently? Where did he go wrong? He arrived at the hospital in record time. parking haphazardly in a doctor's only spot. He rushed inside, the smell of antiseptic and disease assaulting him. He went to the information desk, breathless. Arthur Collins. My father. He's been admitted. Which room? The receptionist typed slowly. Coronary care unit. Room 304. David didn't wait for the elevator. He climbed the stairs, 2 steps at a time. His heart pounded, not from exertion, but from fear. Fear what he would find. A father intubated, unconscious, or worse, an empty room. He stopped at the door of room 304, his breath ragged. He hesitated for a second, composing himself, preparing for the worst. Then he went in. The scene inside the room was nothing like he had imagined. There was no ICU drama, no frantic beeping. The heart monitor showed a calm, steady rhythm. And his father, Arthur, wasn't lying there, pale and dying. He was sitting up in bed, propped up by some pillows. He wore one of those hospital gowns that never seemed to close properly, but there was a dignity in his posture that David hadn't seen in years. His eyes, usually clouded by age and loneliness, were clear and sharp. They met David's, and there wasn't the relief David expected. There was something more, a calm assessment, a silent strength. You came, Arthur said. His voice wasn't weak or pleading. It was a simple statement of fact. David stood in the doorway, suddenly feeling like a boy caught doing something wrong. All the excuses he'd rehearsed in the car, the traffic, the importance of the meeting, the misunderstanding, died on his lips. They seemed hollow and insulting in the face of his father's stillness. Dad, I'm sorry, he managed to say. I didn't know. I thought. You thought it was just a cough. Arthur finished for him, without a hint of accusation. Just the truth. You thought I was a nuisance. David shuddered. No, I never. Don't lie, David, Arthur said, and the stillness in his voice was more devastating than any scream. Not anymore. Not to me, and not to you. You left me in that hallway. I could have died there. The stark truth hung between them. David felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He had spent the last decade building an empire based on his ability to control narratives, to shape perception. But here, in this sterile hospital room, there was no narrative. Only facts. The nurse called, David said, almost accusingly. She said, she mentioned Mom. Arthur nodded slowly. She's a kind woman. She reminded me of things I've forgotten myself. And, apparently, she reminded you too. He looked at his own hands, lying in his lap. Hands that were once strong and calloused, now thin and stained by age. You know, David, for a long time, I defined myself by you. David Collins' father. The man who sacrificed so that his son could succeed. I accepted the loneliness, the invisibility, because I thought it was the price of your success. I thought it was my role. He raised his eyes again, and David saw a fire in them that didn't come from anger, but from a newfound clarity. Tonight, lying in that hallway, I realized something. My role isn't to be your stepping stone. My role is to be Arthur Collins. A man, not a burden. David stepped forward, his hands outstretched in a pleading gesture. Dad, I can fix this. I will fix this. I'll hire the best private nurse. I'll move you to a better place. Arthur raised a hand, silencing him. The gesture was so powerful that David stopped immediately. You don't understand, do you? It's not about money. It's not about hiring help. It never was. Arthur's gaze was piercing. It's about the promise. Not the part about taking care of me, but the part about never being alone. He took a deep breath, the sound amplified by the silence of the room. You left me alone in the worst possible way, David. Surrounded by 100 people, but completely alone. And the irony? It was a stranger who kept me company. It was a stranger who saved me. It was a stranger who reminded you that you had a father. Shame was a heavy cloak on David's shoulders. He had no defense. He was guilty of all the accusations. What do we do now? David asked, his voice barely a whisper. Arthur looked at him for a long moment. Now, he said, his voice gaining a strength David hadn't heard since his childhood. Now you listen. The word listen hung in the air, laden with the weight of a decade of one-sided conversations. David, the CEO, the negotiator, the man who always commanded the room, was being instructed to remain silent. And, for the first time in his adult life, he obeyed. He pulled the uncomfortable vinyl chair closer to the bed and sat down, his hands inert between his knees. Arthur didn't begin with anger. He began with pain. He described, with desolate clarity, the feeling of being left in the hallway, the humiliation of being invisible, the growing terror as the pain in his chest worsened and his voice was not heard. He didn't do it to evoke pity, but to force David to witness the reality his negligence had created. "I wasn't afraid of dying, David," Arthur said, staring at a distant point on the wall. "I made peace with that a long time ago. I was afraid of dying as a nuisance, as a name on a waiting list, forgotten by your own son." Then, he spoke of the sacrifices. He mentioned the carpentry workshop to collect a debt, but to illustrate a point. "I didn't sell those tools in that wood because I needed the money, son. I sold them because I believed in your dream more than in my own. And all I expected in return was nothing. Financial return. It was a place in his world. Not at the center of it. Just a place." David lowered his head, unable to meet his father's gaze. Each word was a precise stab to his conscience. "You gave me a smartphone so you could text me instead of calling," Arthur continued, his voice firm. "You visited me on holidays with a watch in your hand, thinking about the next meeting. You asked me, 'How are you?' as a formality, not as a question. You didn't see me anymore, David. You saw an obligation on your calendar." The silence that followed was filled only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. The sound of Arthur's heart, constant, strong, a heart that, despite being damaged, still beat with unwavering truth. Finally, David raised his eyes, tears streaming down his face. They weren't the performative tears of a man trying to get away with something. They were genuine tears of shame and loss. "I lost myself, Dad," he whispered. "Somewhere along the way, I started to believe my worth was in my bank account, in my business. I became this." He gestured to his expensive suit, now wrinkled and stained with sweat. "A man who leaves his own father in an emergency room because of a dinner." Arthur nodded, not with forgiveness, but with understanding. "Yes, you became that." It was at that moment that the door opened and Sophia, the nurse, entered for one last check before actually going home. She paused, taking in the scene. David flinched under her gaze, recognizing the voice from the phone. She ignored David and addressed Arthur. "How are we feeling, Arthur?" The familiarity and warmth in her tone were evident. "Better, Sophia." "Much better," Arthur replied, and a small smile touched his lips. "Thank you for everything." Sophia smiled back. "Just doing my job." She turned to David, her face now a mask of professional neutrality. "Mr. Collins, the doctor will be here in the morning to discuss the options. Cardiac catheterization is the most likely. He will need follow-up and rehabilitation, and he won't be able to be alone for the next few weeks." She handed David a leaflet. "Here are some options for home care agencies and assisted living facilities." David grabbed the leaflet as if he were picking up a burning object. Assisted living facilities. Nursing homes. Was this what he had become? The kind of son who puts his father in a place? But Arthur spoke before David could protest. "Thank you, Sophia. I'll take a look at it." David looked at his father, shocked. "Dad, no. You're coming home with me. We have plenty of space." "The children?" "No," Arthur said calmly, but purposefully. "The decision was already made. I'm not going to be a guest in your house, David. And I'm not going to be a burden. Tonight taught me one thing. I need my own life. My own community." He looked at the leaflet in David's hands. "I don't see this as an end. I see it as a beginning. A place with other people. Activities. Doctors nearby. Independence. A place where I don't have to wait for my busy son to have time to take me to the doctor." Those words were the final turning point. Arthur wasn't punishing David. He was freeing himself. He was reclaiming his autonomy in a way David could never have predicted. David's final act of abandonment led Arthur to surrender to the idea of depending on his son. "But the promise," David stammered. "I promised you would never be alone." "And I won't be," Arthur said, and for the first time, David saw a glimmer of genuine hope in his father's eyes. "But my companionship can't depend solely on you. That's not fair to you, and it certainly isn't fair to me." The promise, David, wasn't about a building. It was about connection, respect, love. He reached out, not in supplication, but for connection. "If you want to fix this, don't move me into your house. Visit me at mine. Not because you have to, but because you want to. Call, not to check a box, but to talk. Bring my grandchildren, not as a holiday obligation, but so they can meet their grandfather. Be a son, not a crisis manager. David finally understood. Redemption wouldn't come from one grand gesture, but from 1,000 small acts of presence and sincerity. He took his father's hand, feeling its thin, papery skin. He held it with a gentleness he hadn't felt in years. "I will," David said, his voice firm with a new resolve. "I promise." Arthur squeezed his hand. "I know." In the following weeks, David kept his word. He was present at every doctor's appointment. He helped Arthur research assisted living communities, listening to his opinions, respecting his wishes. Together they chose a vibrant place with a garden, a community carpentry workshop, and a poker group on Thursdays. Their relationship wasn't magical. Healed. There were scars. But they were talking. Really talking. David was learning to listen. Arthur was learning to trust again. The day Arthur moved into his new apartment, David helped him unpack. In a place of honor on the shelf, Arthur placed the old photo of himself and Martha. Next to it, the photo of 5-year-old David on his shoulders. David looked at the photos. "I'm sorry, Dad, for everything." Arthur placed his hand on his son's shoulder, the same gesture from decades ago at the cemetery. But now the roles were reversed. It was Arthur who was the rock. "The past is the past, son. What matters is what we build from now on." The real injustice is not just being abandoned. It's being led to believe that your only usefulness is sacrifice. The greatest tragedy is forgetting your own worth for the sake of others. That night, in the cold of a hospital corridor, I was reminded, by a stranger, that my life was still mine. My son didn't come back because of a plea, but because of an inconvenient truth spoken by someone who cared enough to be my voice. The healing didn't come from the forgiveness I gave him, but from the autonomy I gave myself. Sometimes, the greatest proof of love isn't holding someone tightly, but building your own strength so that you never again need to be held by obligation. I didn't need my son to save me. I needed him to witness me saving myself. And that made all the difference.